COVID-19 coronavirus, as some of us call it, update, where we share some of the latest trends in LA County and also answer questions that may be on your mind. If we have to start with a word of prayer, so just bow your heads. Most gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you again for yet another day and for yet all the blessings that you have bestowed upon us and those yet to arrive or for us to recognize. We thank you for everyone participating here and for those who are on their way virtually to share, to listen, to learn, and to better understand what you have in store for us. Be with us to keep us throughout the hour, keep our minds, our hearts open and porous so that we may not only share, but be able to learn. Use me, dear Lord, in Jesus' name I pray, amen. Okay, I'm going to share my screen so that I can kind of go ahead and get started with going through the data. And then I'll come back after I go through the data, we will answer some questions. So as I mentioned, this is the 11th update, and we've covered a lot of things. You know, it's sort of interesting. I was on a call before, work-related call before I started this meeting, and we were reflecting over the last several months, and it's now been 5 months that we've been in this, although we've been probably closer to 3.5 months or so that we've been doing this, but a lot has happened. We've learned a lot, but in some ways we just haven't learned enough, as you'll see with the data. And so today's conversation, as usual, is to go over some data, some trends, try to provide some insight to that data so it's actually useful, helpful in context, and then answer questions. And again, all questions are important questions. And as I usually start out, just to remind folk that this is an important disease, different from the flu, different from some of the other viruses that we encounter, and that it actually has a fairly protracted incubation period, and a large number of individuals are asymptomatic or minimally affected, which means that you can be contagious for quite a bit of time. And that might be either before you become symptomatic, or if you're not symptomatic at all, for the entire period of time, meaning up to a month or 45 days, that you could be contagious. And it's because of this that this is a challenging syndrome, a very challenging disease to deal with, because it spreads unknowingly from person to person or groups to groups without anyone knowing about it. And just as an example, I'm not sure how much you all have read about different case histories, but there was a nice case that was discussed earlier over the weekend, where they described a single person who was in an elevator, who had minimum symptoms, who ended up being the source contact for 61 unique other patients. So this was someone who was in an elevator who became the source for 61 other individuals who contracted the disease. And so this is an infectious disease, and it's not just while you're in front of people, but it leaves residue of contagious material around and about where the infected person may be for others to contract the disease or even transmit the disease. So it's, again, very, very important to think about this a little different than your average cold or flu. Again, despite the growing conversation and discussion about this virus being airborne, it is primarily a droplet spread disease. Now, remember, everything is in a continuum. And so you have things that are absolutely airborne, like measles, right? And then you have something like the common cold virus, which is definitely much more droplet. Then you have things that are in between from a continuum standpoint of view. And COVID-19 is definitely closer to the common cold with regard to it being droplet, but it does have some airborne features. But again, if it was closer to measles, we would have many, many more hundreds and millions of people affected by this disease. So think of it as, importantly, as something that is a droplet, minor airborne, but a droplet disease where droplets may actually be emitted unknowingly from someone who is asymptomatic, meaning by speech, by a sneeze, by a cough, and then that those droplets themselves may land on a surface. And so touching objects and surfaces are really important. Despite some conversation early on that maybe that wasn't a big deal, again, this is now coming back that people are stressing how important it is to think about not just wearing a mask, but also using hand hygiene. So again, I just want to really stress this, that we really are talking about the typical droplet, airborne droplet transmission, which means coughing, sneezing, even talking, for that matter, in close proximity to someone who might be infected for prolonged periods of time, meaning more than 5 or 10 minutes, for example, could increase your risk, as well as being in the area where that individual is and touching something that may have an infected particle on it that you then transmit to your, to your mucosa, to your mouth, nose, or eyes. So again, very important to think about that. So I'm going to go through the data, and I'd like to always start by reminding you all where we started. Right, we started here on April 6th, just May, June, July, 3.5 months ago. 3.5 months ago, we had 16,000 confirmed cases and 385 deaths in Los Angeles County. Now we have 400,000 cases and almost 8,000 deaths. And you can see the trends of new cases per day, which is not just simply because we're testing people. You can see that that slope is getting more steep. And you can see that the overall death toll, even though there's a slight downward trend, overall, we still have many days where we are near maximum number of deaths. So just today, there were 94 deaths today, which is almost double of what it was yesterday. So there are a significant number of people still contracting the disease and becoming symptomatic, as well as people dying from the disease. Now, I live in Long Beach, which borders the Orange Curtain or Orange County. And on my bike ride this morning, I can tell you, as I rode through Orange County in haste, people were in stark denial. No one had a mask on, literally no one had a mask on. And they were congregated in settings and walking about on sidewalks, going into restaurants, you name it. Not a single person had a mask on. And what you can see is that everyone's kind of gotten lulled into this complacency without looking at their own data. So the blue line here is Los Angeles. Los Angeles was always higher than Orange County. And this was, as you can see in the sort of yellow-orange line, Orange County's here is below. So if you go to July 1, comparatively speaking, we were about twice the rate of Orange County. And if you go back even further, we were about 3 to 4 times the rate of Orange County. So there was clear this lag of Orange County, and Orange County is simply saying, nah, coronavirus can't get me, so to speak. But now you can see that they've caught up to LA County, okay? And now they're past LA County. If you just look at the number of new cases. Inland Empire is also, was always kind of high, but they're going up as well. But Orange County has now surpassed LA County with the number of new cases per 100,000 of the population. Yet they have not changed other ways. And so, again, this is very, very important. This is not just reflective of testing availability. It's actually a reflection of new symptomatic disease. We are testing more people, however, compared to what we had available in May, right? Versus what we had available in June, versus now what we have available in July. So we are actually testing more individuals. What's very interesting, and this is a good thing that we have more tests available, is that the percent of test positive are staying about the same. Now, we'd have to go back to like March, but in March, we were really down here, around 2 to 3% of people who are tested were positive. The fact that we are back to this 7.5 or 8% range of people who are tested positive means that almost 1 in 12 people who are tested are positive. Now, just think about that. That's 1 in 12 people who tested are positive. This is the antigen test, not the antibody test. So this means that if you just look around, you think about going out in a crowd, there are probably unknowingly, in a group of 50 or 100 people, there may be 4 to 8 or 10 people in that crowd who are positive and don't know they're positive. Okay, so that's how sneaky this disease is. That's how pervasive and prevalent this disease is. This is just an update on some of the data as it relates to age and race. And what you see here is that the majority of new cases are under 50, right? So this is the line that actually breaks 50. And you can see that more than 50%, closer to 65% of all the new cases are under 50. And this reflects who's going out and who's about, and who's actually exposed to risk. Still, we know that people who die from this disease, the majority of those individuals, 65% of those individuals are over 65. But look at this. Some of the folk on this call represent this 17% of people between 50 and 64. So again, said another way, 1 in 6 people who die from this disease are my age. Okay? And so that makes it very real to me. Even if you took 35 to 49, that's, somewhere around 1 in 20 people, okay, die of that age. Virtually no small children are dying from this, but they certainly can take this disease back and transmit it to older individuals, okay? And as we learned last week, not everyone, even though obesity, diabetes, and heart failure and some of these chronic diseases that affect the lung put you at increased risk for death, we do know that not everyone who dies is morbidly obese or have chronic disease. There are people who actually have no otherwise what we think are complicated chronic diseases who are dying from this. That's the minority, but it still happens, okay? When you look at race, we know that in Los Angeles County, we have more Latinos per populace than anyone else. But the next most common group are white and then actually even Asian. And so Blacks represent a disproportionate number of the cumulative cases of people who have suffered from this disease or been diagnosed with this disease. Very, very important, because we should actually be, by population, we should be down where the Asians are, but we actually are higher than that. And again, a lot of it has to do with some of the social determinants of health that we talked about. Now, if we look at disproportionate deaths, what you see in the gray bar is the proportion of people in these 4 groups: Latino or Latinx, white or Caucasian, Asian, Black, based on just census data. And in the gray bars, okay, is just what proportion of our population in LA County are Latinx, for example. And again, these are crude numbers, and it's based on census data. So it's actually probably a little bit higher in some and lower than others. But you can see here that it's about 37% or so for Latinx, whites just under 40%, Asian around 16, 17%, and Black around 8.5, 9%. But when you look at disproportionate death is occurring in Latinos and in Blacks. Disproportionate less death is occurring in whites and Asian. And this is seen in other states as well. We know that we saw this very same data in New York. And it's not because there's something intrinsic about being Black per se genetically or anything like that. It's actually very complicated. Has to do with health resources, has to do with larger proportions of those individuals with comorbidities and chronic disease. It also has to do with the way the healthcare system treats Blacks and Latinos. There's structural racism in healthcare, and there are worse outcomes, even after you control for education and wealth. And so even when sick, Latinos and Blacks don't necessarily get treated with the same level and quality of care. And COVID-19 in some ways is just showing that, or underscoring that once again. With regard to just hospitalizations, so in the dark blue, what you see is just the number of people in ICUs across LA County. And back in April, we were at our height. We saw sort of leveling off of that. And now you can see the beginning of July, we are now going back up. So in my own hospital, I will tell you, we've been extremely busy. We have, if we compare our numbers to end of April, so let's just say at the end of April, if I look at the total number of people who are in my hospital at the end of April, I now have 150% to 160% of people who were in my hospital compared to before. So, for example, if I had 100 people who were diagnosed with COVID-19 in my hospital at my high point at the end of April and the beginning of May, I now have 160 people. And if I had, for example, 25 people in the ICU out of that 100 at the end of April and May, now I have 50. Okay, so in my hospital alone, we are the busiest we've ever been, both with non-ICU and ICU patients. Okay, and many of the hospitals in surrounding communities are going up, and you can see this by the accumulation in this graph. Total numbers of people who are in the hospital have gone up compared to our peak before. And total numbers of people in the ICU have gone up compared to our peak before. Okay, and these numbers are growing. If I just look at our last week's data, we're still on the upward trend. We're not flattening out. So we have not even seen the peak of this yet. So when you look at reopening the state, you know, we were poised to move to stage 3 businesses with movie theaters and gyms had opened, et cetera, and that began in the early part of June. And as many of you know, Governor Newsom said, we're going to sort of back off on that. So we sort of retreated back to stage 2 in some ways. Many of the gyms have been closed, movie theaters and other venues that were sort of stage 3 venues have closed, but not all of them. And so the question then becomes, you know, sort of what's happening, and are we effectively slowing the spread? And can we kind of maintain status quo, or do we actually need to really shut things down again? And so if you just go through these questions, do we have sufficient hospital capacity? We have some, but our capacity has definitely been eaten away at quite a bit over the last 2 weeks. We have sufficient PPE. We have sufficient testing. That's true. Do we have sufficient case and contract tracing capacity? No. Our public health department is woefully understaffed. Our mortality rates by age, poverty, et cetera, are they stable? No, they're going up. Are hospitalization rates going up? Yes, they're going up. And do all high-risk populations have adequate access to testing? They do not. Most of our excess testing is occurring in affluent areas, not in impoverished areas. In fact, if you go to the inner city, what was prior a 1 to 2 day wait to go and get tested if you went online is now over 2 weeks wait to get tested. So if you just went through these simple questions, the answer would be that we're not slowing spread, and we should not be opening up. And if anything, we should be considering kind of closing things back up. So I will tell you that the headline in today's paper was LA County or California poised to be second state to order stay-at-home orders, okay? Which is kind of important. because that actually has other complications and consequences attached to that. But clearly, people are proceeding in their daily lives as if things are okay. And clearly, we know in the hospitals that people are still getting sick, people are still dying, and the risk of this disease continuing to spread through our communities is still significant, as we still have so many more susceptible individuals. So with that, I am going to just open it up to questions that people might have. But I wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page as it relates to the data. I can, if folk want, review some of the data as it relates to the other states if you want, but I'll leave the time for you all to ask any questions that you might have.
I have a question. It seemed like the model we follow is from 1918, basic mask and social distancing. Have they made any modifications from the 1918 model that, things changed since then? Have we learned anything that could be done differently from 1918 than today?
Unfortunately, not a lot. So what do we have, over the last 100 years? What do we have now that we didn't have then? On the one hand, we have much more densely populated cities now than then. And so there's a higher risk of transmission. From a technology medicine standpoint of view, we have at least the hope that we'll come up with an effective therapy or vaccine, because we have the science to investigate that or explore that. But when it comes to preventing spread, it's the same thing. We have nothing new. It's simple physical distancing and the preventive measures of masking and washing hands. Obviously, they only had soap and water back then and not as much running water everywhere. And we have antiseptics, right? We have gels that we can carry in our purses or pockets, right? So there are some conveniences afforded to us now compared to then. But if you really think about it, the strategies that they had in place then, other than the science side, are no different than the strategies that we have today with regard to what we can do and personally commit to do to address our personal safety and protect ourselves and others. It's the same fundamental physical measures of hand cleaning, keeping distance, using good common sense and wearing a mask. So unfortunately not. It's a good question, Dave, but unfortunately we don't have that.
So as you made the observation this morning on your bike ride, I also made this past weekend. What, in terms of the apparent denial in the Orange County area, and I know that's not exclusive to them, but just in your own opinion, what do you think is attributing to that when we have all these numbers in front of us that's telling us, including the media, that the virus is actually spreading and increasing?
Yeah, so I think it's a fair question, right? That common sense would dictate people's behavior be different. I've gone, I think, full circle from being, trying to have some compassion to be angry to almost name calling folk in terms of their behavior as idiocy and stupidity to returning back to compassion. So I think this is just sort of what I think about. Like, there's what people talk about on the surface, right? And on the surface, people talk about their rights being infringed upon, and sort of just their freedom and all of that, right? And that's a big thing, and that's it's partly politicized, partly populated by some particular opinions, both on social media and the news. So there's that sort of rhetoric. There's also, however, a rhetoric, I think, around fear, like real fear. And so if we just think about our own human behavior, some of the things that we are logically aware of, knowledgeable about, and fear, we actually take actions and make decisions which are counterproductive or against the very thing that we say we want to do, right? This happens all the time. Let's just take something simple that I think we've all dealt with, which is like procrastinating when you're trying to study for a test, right? Like, we all know that we need to study for a test. We all just want to get, an A in the class or do well on the test. We all know that. We know what it takes to do well on the test. Yet, the same individual will procrastinate. And we know the consequences of procrastination, right? It's the cognitive dissonance that exists is rampant, right? And I can use a number of examples, but if you guys just pause and think, this is pervasive in our own behaviors. And so I have some compassion for that, because when I think about what drives those sort of behaviors, it's actually often fear. It's not disbelief. The refusal to learn something, the refusal to acknowledge something, when you're, a reasonably intelligent person or better, isn't because of irrationality. It's because of fear. And so you say, well, what are they afraid of? Well, if you admit that this thing is real and that you can get it, you have to admit to a whole bunch of other stuff, right, that people don't want to deal with. I'll give you a quick example. I have doctors. I probably can't say too much detail, because at a teaching hospital who are smart, who are working in a discipline where they see patients come into the hospital sick with COVID-19, being put on ventilators, some dying. So they see this right in front of them. It's like not a question. So we're not even talking about like Orange County. We're talking about young doctors who there is no question about whether this is real or not. Okay, you hear what I'm saying? And these young doctors will then go and congregate and go out.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? And get sick. Okay, that's as far as I can go with the story, because I'll be giving you too much information. But this is a fact. Okay,
Right.
This is a fact. Now you'd say, well, here are really well-informed people. They've seen the consequences up close, yet they're in denial themselves. And again, there's a certain. It has nothing to do with the intellect. It has nothing to do with rationale or logic. Nothing. But it does have something to do with this idea of fear and how we handle fear, right? The idea that something bad could happen to me, one way to deal with that is to embrace that and protect yourself. The other way to deal with it is to be in denial. And denial is the currency of the way most people deal with things they're afraid of. Okay, it's super common. So I see when I'm riding through Huntington Beach, or when I see all this, that's why I think that's kind of going on to people, and they'll latch on to whatever rhetoric to repeat. But personally, deep down inside, people are afraid, and instead of embracing it, learning more, and dealing with it, which causes a change. It's emotionally difficult because they have to assess some things and they have to change their behavior. Instead of going through all that, you can just be in denial. It's easier. You can kind of stay in la la land, and it gets it gets supported and reinforced because they don't know anybody, right? So if you don't know anyone who's been sick yourself, and if you do know someone who is sick, they're like, oh, I had it. I went to a COVID party. By the way, there are actually COVID-19 parties where they invite a bunch of people to come, and they know that there are people who are infectious and they're sick, and they get invited to the party to get other people infected. There people are hosting those parties, and they're doing that so that they can get infected and be immune, right? The idea is we just spread it around, we get immune, and we don't have to worry about it. People are actually doing this, okay? So it's not logical, it's not rational, but it's rational logical to them when it's based from a fear perspective, if that makes sense. I think that's the biggest driver. And so I've learned to develop some compassion for that stupidity. I still call it stupid. But you know, anyone who lives in fear day to day, you have to have compassion.
Right. All right. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Along those same lines, somebody was telling me about how somebody knew they had COVID and they still went to a workplace, and they know somebody else knows some coffee and was wondering how they got past security, but they say must have held their breath or something to get past security. But why would somebody, know you have COVID, still want to go around to other people?
Yeah. So again, rather, I think we think about, the motivators of people, and sort of settle into the human, sort of the human condition. Everyone on this call, by the nature that you have a computer, that you're sitting up listening to me talk about this stuff, etc. Relatively speaking, one way or the other, we're privileged individuals. We're very privileged people. Okay. We never know what kind of conditions are right work. And there are people who go to work because they have no choice, right? They feel like they actually have to work. And it's everything from undue burden on my coworkers, which is its own pressure. And again, may be perceived or real, but it's real to that individual. To, I need the money. And if you're sick, you have to be off. You might have to be off for weeks. And depending on your employer, you may or may not get that check. Your unemployment may or may not kick in right away, right? So I'm just using two sort of examples, but there's a lot of different experiences that many of us may not be able to relate to directly because we're just blessed in that way, differently. That may, say if we do the substitution test, well, if I knew I was positive, I wouldn't go to work, right? And I think for me, I could say that without a doubt, being rational, logical, and being privileged, I could say that without a question. But I could also understand why someone else who might not be in my situation might feel like they have to take the risk or take the risk for other people. So again, another space for compassion. It's something that people should not do. Employers should do everything they can to make it easy for someone to not work if they're sick or have symptoms, right? Not even being positive, just having symptoms, even mild symptoms. An employer should do everything they can to make it easy for someone to say, I'm not feeling well, I'm going to come home. But I can tell you, not every employer makes it easy for that to happen. A lot of employers don't have the support or the infrastructure so that someone can say, I don't feel well, I'm going to stay home. And that person is taken care of who stays home, and then someone else is going to come in and still do the work. Right? It's depending on the industry. There's a lot of pressure for people to work for sure. Yeah. I know the news has, been interesting. People have talked about, vaccines more. There was actually even a little conversation that we may have a vaccine as soon as October or something like that. I pray that that's the case. I won't be holding my breath. at all. Why? Well, because promising data that they're looking at has nothing to do with efficacy. What they're looking at right now, when you read reports, is that, hey, we have a vaccine, a tentative vaccine, and a number of companies have shown this, where in some early models, we have shown that you can provoke immunity. In other words, you can develop antibodies when I give you the vaccine. That has nothing to do with efficacy. What you really want to know is whether or not you develop a high or strong enough immune response, and whether that immune response is durable. Because it doesn't help if you have an immune response, but the immune response doesn't protect you. And it doesn't help if the immune response only protects you for a week or a day, right? So even the flu vaccine, if it works, and it works about half the time, it protects you for the season, right? So you're protected for 5 to 6 months. And the flu vaccine is a lot less lethal and a lot less effective in some ways, right? So we have now started, using some of these test vaccines in Africa and in Brazil, two of the places where there are lots of people of color, hint, hint, Tuskegee, okay? Not as bad as Tuskegee. But the reason why they're doing it in these places, the reason that they're giving the public, is that the rate of spread is so fast that they can get the results faster, okay? So if you have more people infected, if you simply vaccinate a group of people in a highly spreading population, then you can turn around your vaccine data faster. I'm not sure that that's completely the entire motive of choosing these sort of countries of color, but nonetheless, this is why they're talking about a time frame in October, because they should have some preliminary data back from these countries. I think most people who I talk to, and if you listen to the right people on the news, particularly those people who are vaccine researchers or infectious disease experts who are not paid consultants, when you listen to them talk, even on CNN, when they do an appropriate interview, they will hedge their bets very quickly and talk about the vaccine being a year to 2 years away. That's very common for the sort of more objective infectious disease specialists to talk about those sort of timelines. Andy, I think you may. If a person tests positive and is no longer symptomatic, at what point should the person retest before returning to work? Have you heard anything about the forthcoming home test? Okay. So remember, there are CDC guidelines and state guidelines. And the CDC and state guidelines are the same, right? They actually do not put in place a retest strategy before returning to work. It's actually all about how many days you've been asymptomatic, right? So if you test positive and you have symptoms, then it's 7 days after your symptoms have resolved completely, okay? That's a CDPH, CDC guideline. If you are someone who is an exposed contact individual of a high-risk contact person, you get tested and you're positive today, then you have to wait at least 14 days, and some will say 21 days, depending on sort of your exposure timeline. So that's what's printed in CDPH and CDC, and it has nothing to do with the retest strategy. It doesn't mean that employers may require that. So schools, the number of people, employers are requiring people to be test negative, and then they will perform periodic tests throughout over a period of time. That's above and beyond the CDPH, the Department of Public Health for California, or the CDC's guidelines recommendations. That's above and beyond that. And the reason why is because it is clear that you can stay positive beyond the time that you're contagious with the antigen test, okay? And for the antibody test is not reliable at all, with regard to telling someone that they're no longer infective. So let's just separate things. When you get this swab, where someone does the brain biopsy we talked about, right, or the pharyngeal swab, that's testing for the antigen. When you test for the antigen, you're testing for a live virus. If done properly, that test actually works really, really well. Hold on one second. Yes, I shall. Thank you. I'm sorry for that. So the antigen is evidence of live virus. And if you have a good sample taken, it's over 95, 98%. It's pretty good, okay? The problem with the antigen test is that if you test someone too early after they've been exposed, it's commonly negative because it takes some time for the virus to build up in your system and to go into your tissues. So let's say, I'm looking at Keith. Let's just say Keith was the sort of typhoid Keith, right? So Keith had the virus and I didn't know it, but Keith knew it. And he came over and he spent some time and, you know, he convinced me that he wasn't sick or anything like that. And he was in my office and boom, you know, I got infected. And then he called me later on. He goes, Daryl, I was sick, you know, and I just wanted to see if you would get infected to see if all that health stuff you do works. All right. So, you know, Keith was going to, do an experiment on me. Well, if I went to the hospital the next day to get tested, it would not be positive because it's too early. Even after a known exposure, it's too early. Even 3 days or 4 days, it may be too early. So that's a problem with the antigen test, is that an early exposure, particularly if you have no symptoms, it's not reliable, okay? And once you have symptoms, it becomes reliable. The challenge then becomes the antigen test doesn't become negative immediately. So you can actually be no longer contagious, but still have a positive test. Okay. The antibody test just tests whether or not you've been exposed. And it doesn't say that your exposure equals non-infection. So you could have a positive antibody test and still be infective at that time. You could also have an antibody test that comes back positive, but it's coming back positive for another virus in the same family and not the coronavirus. So its specificity isn't great and its sensitivity isn't perfect either. And it's why currently the antibody test is not approved for testing in people who have symptoms for coronavirus, okay? There are a lot of non-approved tests that are available. People are using antibody tests to screen for populations, like in a lot of the back to school plans, for example. Antibody testing is part of that, right? But they're really just trying to look at an asymptomatic group of people and say, can I screen for anyone who's been exposed? And if they've been exposed, then we'll take those people and do some more. We'll quarantine them. We'll do an antigen test. We'll do a variety of things depending on the agency. If you're antibody negative, then you haven't been exposed. It's a cheaper test. It's quick and dirty. It comes back very fast. And we'll just do those tests periodically. So for Isabella at Fordham, they actually are employing an antibody test, and they're going to require everybody to have a negative test before they start back in the fall. And they're going to periodically test the people who are enrolled at some interval to be determined by the student health group. So again, the different tests are used differently. The current test that is employed for real disease and symptomatic individuals is the antigen test. The antibody test is used in very limited fashion to just be able to say you're exposed to the virus or a virus like that virus, if that makes sense. Okay, good question. All right, now I got some private ones. So the antibody test is a blood test. So that's an easy enough question. So you can just take a little prick on your finger, like a sugar test, what have you. They do have some tissue as well, but it's not as good. But your immunoglobulins circulate freely in your bloodstream. Okay. Let's see. Let me see this. Okay, so there's a question by an unnamed person who is asking, how will the vaccine really help if basically if you've been infected, for example? It's a really good question, actually. If I get infected, it is likely that I'll have some sort of immunity for probably 8, 10, 12 weeks. Okay, that's what people think. It won't be permanent immunity, but people think it will last me about 3 months or so. Okay, so the question is, on the one hand, well, why not just get infected versus the vaccine? Well, I mean, the vaccine is likely not to give you long-term immunity, which is true. The difference is if the vaccine is considered to be safe, ultimately proven to be safe, then the risk of me getting the vaccine and getting 3 months of immunity does not include death, right? Versus if I get the disease, the risk includes death at worst, or having some lung function messed up, right? Or having a stroke or some other complication, right? So, you know, don't ask me the natural next question is, Daryl, are you going to get the vaccine when the vaccine comes out? Don't ask me that question. All right. Don't ask me that question right now. I refuse to go on record answering that question right now. But what I would say in general, proven vaccines that are considered safe, it's always a better option if you have to pick than getting the disease, right? If those are your two choices. I think there's a third choice, but for the two choices in the question, get the disease and become immune versus get the vaccine and become immune. If I only had those two choices, I would pick the vaccine and become immune, then roll the dice with the disease, personally. Okay, good question. Elder Means, sister, good to see you. All right, any other questions?
Hey, Doc, one of the issues, though, that given the fact that people in certain counties feel like they're beachgoers, relatively healthy, so they'll take their chances given some of the numbers that have not totally implicated their either their demographic or their age group, and so they're willing to risk it because they're seemingly the numbers are low in terms of their demographic or their age, and then even so, they're figuring survivability. So I'll take my chances going the other way. And until death starts to ravage the population, I mean, what's going to shake them from that ideology?
Maybe not much, but like I said, I think that they're grasping onto the ideology out of fear in the first place. And so, you know, it's a strong protective mechanism or defensive mechanism for them to grasp upon that ideology. And, you know, fear is a strong motivator. So it would take something very dramatic to change, you know, their thinking, their posture. And again, either them or someone they know are affected by this, and then they may think differently. But I would say the same thing, you know, to many people. And I will say that that's bolstered by other things. It's kind of complicated. So, for example, I was on the West Side last week a couple of times, two different times. Everyone had a mask on. Okay, like everyone had a mask. You coming out, walking down the street, everyone had a mask. So similar demographic. I mean, white folk, okay, well-to-do, relatively healthy, but they were taking it super serious. And so I think some of that has to do with other beliefs. Okay, I'll just leave it at that, right? There are other beliefs that kind of make this more complicated. And there are other ways that different people, because of those beliefs, still handle fear differently. So I think everyone who is got a working neuron in their brain has rational and reasonable fear about the unknown place to them or their one. How we respond to that fear is complex and vary from person to person and groups to group. But everyone is afraid. That's sort of like, you know, it's sort of like climate change. It's like anything that could be catastrophic, where the facts are put before you, and you simply just refuse to accept it. That is a very powerful protective mechanism for you having to deal with something that's very very powerful, very impactful, particularly something that you may not be able to control, or you may not be able to change your risk, right? So you have two demographics, Derek: white, well off, fairly healthy. On the west side, they're wearing masks like crazy. In Orange County, they're not wearing a mask. And I think that they're two populations, just like our population. They're afraid of getting it, but how they manage, how they deal with it, how they use other parts of their belief system to cope and deal with this, I think is just very different. And so you get very different results. And unfortunately, some of that ideology is either supported or not supported, depending on currently your political persuasion, right? So, Orange County just happens to be a very deep Trump. Huntington Beach is deep Trump territory, okay? And Trump has pandered to this being a nothing bomb since the beginning, right? Doesn't mean they're less afraid, but it gives them an excuse to take this choice, right? All right, good question. Let's see. Assuming the virus will be lingering around, possibly, because there will be some hard heads out there. Will this be a vaccine that has to be given every 3 months? Yeah, it's very likely that if and when they do get the vaccine, that this will not be a one and done vaccine. It's unlikely that this will be a one and done vaccine. And a lot of it just depends on how much this virus will be like the century-old flu, where it sort of went through and then sort of extinguished itself and it was gone, versus how much it will linger around. I think a lot of people believe that this in some ways is like a more perfect virus, right? So if you think about 1918, people were symptomatic very early, and case fatality rate was really high. You got this, you had it wasn't like a 1 in 3, but you have 10 to 20% of the people dying who got it. This is a virus that was extinguishing itself, right? So the people who got it were easily identifiable, and they either got better quickly or they died. That was the flu 100 years ago. Now, we don't know who has it. It hangs around for a long time, and the majority of people who get it actually are fine, right? And it's not as infectious. So what that means is the catch-22 is that as long as there are vulnerable, susceptible people in the population to get this, and we kind of have a slow spread, what you'll end up happening, and this is something that you don't want to properly think about, this is why the virus can stick around for a while, is that you can have the virus sweep through 30, 40% of the people in the population, susceptible people in the population. We don't develop herd immunity. So there's still other people yet to get it, right? And during the time where it's sweeping through 30, 40% of the people in the population, those people who have gotten it are going to lose their immunity, right? And so now it's going to start attacking this other susceptible group. But as it's attacking this other susceptible group, slowly, the people who have prior immunity will now become susceptible again. And that's how a virus like this stays in the population for a long period of time. And the way the vaccine works for a situation like this is You can only extinguish the virus with the vaccine is if it becomes a mandatory vaccine for everyone nearly simultaneously. That would be your best chance of extinguishing the virus from the face of the earth. But that would mean everyone would have to do that, not just in the US, but around the world. Because we've seen that in New Zealand did a phenomenal job containing this, right? They shut down the borders, did all this sort of stuff. And I have to ask themselves, does New Zealand have a case? New Zealand still has a couple of cases here and there, right? But because their density is so small, they are able to isolate and do that. But New Zealand, in order for New Zealand to remain so lucky, they will have to have their borders closed forever. Or they'll have to have such perfect testing procedures for people coming in that people have to be tested and quarantined and everything else, right? And so basically then you have a global sort of shutdown in terms of travel and commerce, etc. And so either you're going to have to do that, or you're going to have to do basically like a worldwide vaccination, or at least close to that, right? Of Europe, of South America, of North America, of a lot of the Asian, including India, China, Japan, etc. You're going to have to vaccinate a whole bunch of people. And we will not have that much vaccine available because people will want to make profit off of it. So I guarantee you there won't be that much vaccine available. People won't be able to afford the amount of vaccine that people will want to sell it for. And so we're not going to get our vaccine-mediated herd immunity, right? Because there are two ways to get herd immunity. Everyone gets infected at the sort of the same time, plus or minus, or you vaccinate a whole bunch of people at the same time. Those are two ways to get your herd immunity. And you need about 70% or so of folk to get herd immunity. So that's a lot of vaccine sort of being distributed and taken around this country and the world if you really wanted to eradicate this virus. So I think the challenge that the virus is going to be with us in one form or the other for a while is pretty high. It's pretty high, like very high.
Dr. Harrington, have you paid attention to the excess death rates during this period?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Have you paid any attention to the excess death rates during this period? People die of other things besides COVID.
Yeah. So they are. We're having some challenges. Part of this is political. So I know the data in LA County is pretty good. It's not this way in every county in every state. So because the prevalence of disease is now so high or going up in our communities, because of that, there are people who are dying of other things that are not COVID related, but have antibodies or evidence of COVID. And we're using antibody tests, not antigen tests, for people who die from like heart failure. And so on their death certificate, they will actually have COVID-19 on their death certificate. It shouldn't be their primary cause of death or even the secondary cause of death. It should actually be listed under related disease or unrelated disease as a fourth line. A lot of it depends on who's filling out the death certificate, the county and the state, and how they use their statistics. So it's a really good question. I think it's hard to know, depending on the county you live in, what proportion of people are really dying of COVID. The reassurance that a lot of this information is in fact fairly good, though, is if we just look at the number of people in the ICU for COVID-19. That's important because you can't fake that, right? That's not a secondary cause. If you're on a ventilator, you can't breathe because you have this, the common sort of pulmonary type disease or syndrome associated with COVID, that represents real disease. So I think in LA County, there probably are some mistakes, but I think we've done pretty good. That's not necessarily true for all counties. There's a move by the White House and by the government to try to circumvent the normal public health reporting and they want everyone to report their stuff to a central agency instead of the CDC. Currently, the CDC's data is fairly scrubbed and clean as it can be, but they're trying to push this into a government database, which would mean that we may not have data that we can trust at all. So it's a really good question. There is a risk of people dying with COVID, not from COVID, and that actually impacting the numbers. But I think the numbers, by and large, are still plus or minus right or true, given the number of people who are hospitalized with COVID, and particularly those who are in ICUs because of COVID. So I think the numbers are probably still pretty reliable.
Dr. Harrington, I have a question. So when a person
Yeah.
dies, they did not have underlying condition, they're fairly young. Are they doing autopsy to find out why they really died? Or if they had an underlying condition? I mean, since it was a mystery?
Yeah, so having an autopsy, if you're at an academic medical center, you can request that autopsy to get done. And then it could be approved, not approved, based on a variety of sort of protocols. If you are young, otherwise healthy, and you die, you can, and there's no cause of death, you may meet criteria for a coroner's case. And if you meet criteria for a coroner's case, then obviously you'll get an autopsy. But there are strict criteria for a coroner's case, and just being young isn't necessarily one of them. If you die of unexplained cause in a certain period of time, you're automatically a coroner's case, for example. But if you had, for example, some mysterious illness and you're in the hospital for 2 weeks and we were trying to figure it out, but we never figured it out and you died, that's not automatically a coroner's case, and it's not automatically required that you would get an autopsy. The family could ask for one, and if it met a protocol or policy, they may be able to get one. And early on, pathologists were not doing autopsies on patients who are COVID positive to just minimize their risk. Now there are procedures or protocols in place to be able to do that, but not every morgue and pathology department has the right environment. You actually have to do the autopsy in a negative pressure room, and most morgues are not negative pressure. So you'd have to have the right environment to do an autopsy in someone who's a COVID positive patient. Hopefully that answered your question. There's a interesting question here. Are we about to have a Planet of the Apes scenario? LOL. I don't think we're going to have I don't think this is a Planet of the Apes scenario per se. I just think that as we move forward, infectious diseases and the way infectious diseases affect our communities, our world, our societies will change because of how we have changed the broader ecosystem. So it's just a consequence of how mankind, womankind, but men are making a lot of these bad decisions, so I'll say mankind, are encroaching upon its habitat-defined space, right? Sort of bullying our way in and sort of messing with nature, messing with ecology. And this sort of disregard and lack of respect for that gives us consequences, real consequences, and be it climate-related consequences or be it pestilence and disease, as the Bible says. We're going to have these things happen. And unfortunately, because the drivers and the drivers, individuals and the drivers in terms of behaviors are not seeking the welfare and the well-being of the large populace, but they're seeking the welfare and well-being of a small elite or minority. Unfortunately, some of those bad decisions continue to be made, and the drivers continue to push us down this path. So this isn't doom and gloom. We'll find a way to deal with this because folk are smart. The real question is do we find ways to avoid stuff like this for the future, right? Or to minimize things like this for the future? That's what I'm more skeptical or concerned about. You know, how much do we learn? Learn from this so that we can move forward in a productive and safe manner.
Say, Doctor, do you, from what you know of it, do you support the various athletic bubbles that are being used to perpetuate the restart of some of these sporting activities? And would you sign off on the bubble idea?
Wow, that's pretty good. So everything actually comes with a compromise, right? Everything, it's a loaded question, because what I'd have to ask you would be, sort of like, what's the goal, right? Why are we doing it? It's not fair to kind of have an opinion in some ways without understanding the motives or the outcome, the reason for doing something. So let's just assume altruistic motives as a whole. People need the socialization, the engagement that sports brings, right? Sports brings a lot of, there's no question there's a business side of it, but in our society and historically in civilization, sports has been something that is pushed, ignited, encouraged a society, a population, in one way or the other. So let's just leave it at that for the sake of it, that those are sort of altruistic outcomes that would occur if we got sports going. If that actually occurred, I'm not sure. If that actually occurred, I think that as an outcome, I think that there are ways to do it and do it relatively safe. And I would sign off on anything that actually took the safety of the players and the support staff as a high priority. Now, the ways to really do that require quarantining, requires looking after and segregating people after the event. It's not the event that's the high risk, believe it or not. It's actually afterwards and people going to dinner and doing all sorts of other things. That's a really big challenge. And we just saw that in the PGA Tour event. So I think if done properly, done correctly to protect everybody, and they took the right measures, it would be extremely inconvenient. It's absolutely doable and possible. And if it were something that satisfied some more altruistic goal in terms of there was a real reason to do it, then yeah, I think it can be done, and I think it can be done well. Absolutely. But I think that if they don't take the necessary precautions, then it will be done horribly, right? And it'll be a disaster.
Right, and then so let me extend it real quick. So the bubble presupposes that everybody remains there. Is that bubble, does that not extrapolate to the school system because the kids have to come home and may engage in things that are quote unquote outside the school bubble?
Yeah, so the school piece, restarting school, is a very different, sort of piece. Number one, there's many more moving parts, right, to schools, even primary education, not just, higher education like colleges. There are a lot more moving parts. People are coming on and off campus. A lot of different things are sort of happening that make it. Sorry, people are just walking in front of my house, staring at my house for some reason. But making it kind of difficult to compare the two. The bubble of professional sports, if you do it correctly, it's a bubble season. Everyone involved with it, the athletes, the support staff, the crew, everybody is quarantined and protected, okay? In a school, those variables are not controlled nearly as the fact, and the things that we will do in the school that provide artificial support or artificial reassurance that things are okay or safety don't really do that. So this idea of periodically testing somebody, well, they're not going to test people every day or every week. So even if they test the people once a month or every 2 months, well, that's still an interval of time where it allows people to be infected and spread it amongst their peers, right? So the school environment is really a big risk. And you'll see all sorts of decisions being made, right? From we're simply just going to take an online class, no in-person option, that to people who offer a mixture, to people who are opening schools back up. And I think the drivers for that are include some social stuff, but also includes revenue in a huge way. Huge revenue. As you know, the federal government's threatening to withhold funds for schools that don't open up. And so there's a whole bunch of things that I think complicate that. But there's no way if you open a school back up that you can have the same sort of control of the moving parts. You could do a lot of things to minimize it, but there's still so many more moving parts in a school, and requires so much more personal accountability and compliance for that to work. But it's going to happen. I can tell you they're going to open schools back up for sure. You know, a number of schools have already announced they're opening back up for the fall.
You mentioned about schools. I was speaking to my daughter, and she was telling me that her two sons, my two grandsons, they only got about, one of them got maybe an hour of online education a week. The other one had maybe 45 minutes. And some in the, and Pam was speaking to one of her coworkers, and she said they got 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon. So it's a big disparity what's happening between the different schools.
Yeah. Yeah, it's no question that this is challenging for a lot of folk, and particularly school systems and students who are not resourced equally. So this again just underscores how a stressor, a disaster, a crisis disproportionately affects some groups more than other groups. So if you're a private school where everyone's got a laptop or an iPad or what have you, and your school, your teachers are paid really well, and no one's being furloughed without pay, and all this other stuff, they're going to get everything they need, 100%, right? And if you're in a public school where, you know, half the student body doesn't even have a device or an iPad or anything like that to take classes, or maybe they don't even have an online platform that's durable and with the complexities to do things the way to make it easy for teachers. So teachers are opting out of doing things and not being held accountable. I mean, you can go through all the scenarios you want. Again, one system is going to have a lot more, you know, unintended consequences that they don't have infrastructure for, that they haven't prepared for or planned for or resourced for. That's going to affect that population more so than other populations. And so again, I mean, I think it's a really good observation, but there's really no domain, no aspect of life when you have a disaster or a crisis, be it war, be it a pandemic like this, be it, you know, large natural disasters, where you don't see disproportionate outcomes to vulnerable populations. It's, you know, simple as that. So whether you're talking about housing security, food security, education security, right? Love security, right? Love and support security. I mean, there's so much insecurity attached to vulnerable populations that becomes unmasked or heightened during, you know, a crisis. And imagine, you know, if you had, you now are forced to be at home, your parents have to work, or your parent has to work. So the kids are at home. There's no one to ensure that they're actually even doing their work or help them with their work, because the parent single man. I mean, there's a lot that happens from a disparity standpoint of view that's attached to this crisis. Dave, do I still have you, or did I lose you? We're okay?
Thank you.
Okay. Other questions? Any questions at all? Good questions. And I think these sort of conversations allow us to think a little bit about, again, as a church community, we can begin thinking a little bit more creatively about how we serve and support, each other or even our communities, right? Because these very challenged questions that you guys are raising are going to affect disproportionately even the church community membership, as well as the community in the immediately surrounding area of our church. And so there are some opportunities to think about how we participate, partner, how we outreach. I hope I haven't depressed anybody that much. I apologize, but if I have.
No,
yeah.
we need the real, Doc. We need the real. One last question for me. Speaking of outreach and what you've experienced in your hospital, and just in general, what would you recommend for the church in terms of a strong or an effective outreach activity?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think things should start with data or information. I think you should find out what people need. Not just always think about what we think they need, but ask what people need. And we might be surprised, right? I mean, it might be that there is food insecurity because there are people who are out of work. That's possible. There might be some education issues that are even more pronounced because of the educational system not serving so many people depend on the public school system, and they might have gaps there. But there's also the psychosocial, emotional support that I think everyone needs, for that matter. A lot of people need that, and some people have found ways to connect, but then there are people who don't have means to connect. And so the church community or a church is by design a social network. That's what the church is. And so do we, try to extend our social network of a church to the community for those who may be less connected? So I could think of things, but it might be worth thinking about whether we ask the community, whether we send something to our surrounding community to see if something, because the church is closed, some of the things that people were taking advantage of or utilizing. Is there a way to provide some of those services even though the church is closed? I don't know the answer to that, but I'm just sort of thinking aloud. And things don't have to be in, I think when you think about situations like this, I was talking to someone yesterday, and, we always think about, we want to always do things in scale, and I don't think that way. I think that, if you help one person or two people or a family, that's powerful. That's one more family than you would have helped had you not extended that. So whether you can help 20 families or 100 families in the surrounding community, I wouldn't think like that. I would ask the question: is there anyone that could be helped? And so you could take a community-wide approach and try to solicit needs, or there may be individuals that we have connection with already that we can participate in trying to help them. So I wouldn't worry about like the volume, because I think these are the sorts of rich experiences and connections that any single person or family is in my view viewed as valuable. So let me I'm not going to go back to the slides, but let me just reiterate again a few important things to folk. First off, the easy stuff. The easy stuff is, wear a mask. When you're in dense areas are going to be in contact with others for two reasons. The whole protection, protect yourself, protect others. And the second is this notion of you just don't need the emotional headache of someone coming at you, some Karen or Joe coming at you, yelling at you because you don't have the mask on or something like that. And depending on where you are, most of us aren't going to be spending all our time in Huntington Beach where no one's coming to you saying like, "Why don't you have a mask on?" But in LA, yeah, that's happening. You go into Trader Joe's, you go someplace, someone's going to say something to you. And so just avoid that blessing out, if you will, that sort of interaction by doing your part, wearing a mask when you're in public and doing things. Early on, I said that masks, particularly like low quality cloth masks per se, are unlikely to protect you efficiently. That's still a true statement. But that same mask that won't protect you completely will protect someone else. It will, not 100%, but it will decrease the sort of droplet transmission and projection, if you will, from your cloth mask. The best case scenario is to get if you're going to use a cloth mask, is to get a pretty good quality cloth mask. Again, see Hope Smith. She has some really nice masks. I've tested those suckers. They work really well for both protecting you and protecting someone else. Okay. And they're quite colorful and pretty, by the way. So that is that. With regard to your hands, wash your hands, soap and water. Just come up with your own routine. My hands were cracked early on when we started this whole broadcast. My hands were cracked and blistered because I was using so much alcohol-based sanitizer. Like everything I did, I was doing that. It was like I was a little neurotic about it. But that set in motion at least enough for me to be habitual in a good way without being kind of neurotic. So, I do it before I get in my car. And I do it at work when I go to my office into the greater office. We wipe down our house, once a day, things like that. But I'm not overly